Hey everyone, it's David Awad, back to make another video and answer some questions. I've been getting a ton of questions from developers and from a couple of clients about what software licenses are and how they work. So I wanted to make this video to try to clear some of that up and just create a forum for some questions. So I don't want to give you any legal advice. None of this is an attorney-client relationship. This is just me answering a couple of questions that I've gotten somewhat commonly over the last couple of months. So let's just start with the basics. When you make a license is just a piece of text. There is no one you talk to. When you use a piece of software in your project as a developer, right? If you are taking a package or a piece of code, you import it, maybe you copy paste a section of it, any of those things are considered usage. When you use that code in your project, that is considered licensed, quote unquote, whether you know that or not. When you take that code, when you run that import statement, you are importing the project, you are using the code, you are implicitly agreeing to that license. So keep that in mind and take a look at the licenses when you import them. That is one of the things that I look for on the other side when I do audits for certain clients of mine who have software projects. I look over the licenses that they've used. We have some custom tools too that you can run to double check the licenses of all the packages you're using. You will be surprised because not every project just lets you do whatever you want with their code. So that is something to be aware of. But there's no one you talk to. You don't have to write anyone. You don't have to do anything. You just take the code and it's in your hands and it's yours to use. So what does the license actually mean? It, one, tells you what you can do, and even more importantly for most people, two, tells you what you cannot do. For example, one, a license might tell you, hey, you can use this project and its code for commercial purposes. You can copy paste it in your own web app or your own startup. Or two, what you can't do. You can't use that GPL v3 code unless you open source your project. You can't use it commercially under any circumstances. Those are the kinds of things that you can see, and that's why this is so important, right? You have to be aware of that fact so that you don't end up getting burned by any license issues. So let me give you a couple of examples just so you can see how this kind of plays out. The business model problem seems to be something like this. Somebody like Introjs creates a useful package to give tours inside of the user experience for web apps, right? Now they make it open source at first because they think it's a fun project and they want to give back, maybe contribute to the community, let's say. That's all well and good. And then everybody copies and pastes it. So Introjs creates a ton of value, but then never captures any of the value. So at the end of the day, these changes in licenses are attempts to capture the value that those projects create at the end of the day. So Introjs has a license example like this. I ran into this with a client of mine not too long ago. So let's look at these two examples. Introjs uses the GNU AGPL. Now, I don't want to go into the specifics of a Pharaoh versus ordinary, etc. I think that would be a long and painful road. But take a look. What they basically tell you is, hey, this is a version of the GPL license, which we'll get into in a little bit, that requires you to open source your code. So if you use their project and you don't open source the code you are creating with it, then you have to open source your code. So you have one of two choices. You either remove the code using Introjs, or you get a license from them, right? It says it right here. We added a commercial license to better support features and versions. If you are using Introjs for a commercial project, you would need to get a commercial license at introjs.com. It's not much more complicated than that, honestly. It's really as simple as that. And you'll note in this particular example, it wasn't until V2 that they added this license. That's why I like this example, because different versions of software have different licenses. If you don't have this license on V1.9.9, maybe that license is different. That's the license that controls. Once you get to V2, they choose to distribute this new license. This is not a license that controls. That is the key thing to be aware of. So now let's try another one that maybe you've heard of. Ansible, popular tool for configuration management. So here we are. Something else to note, GitHub, why I picked this example is because GitHub will put these very handy little pop-ups that give you the checkboxes and the X's. Is this something you can use and for what purpose, which is why I like it. I'll often just say you don't even need a lawyer. Just go and look at the project. Usually they'll highlight these nice little things. Hey, you know, permissions here. This is the GNU GPL license v3. This is most often the kinds of, these GNU licenses are most often the ones that can cause problems. If you are using software for a commercial purpose and you do not want to open source it, this is very often going to be the license you want to watch out for. What it lets you do is it lets you use the project commercially. You can modify, distribute, etc. But if you, as they call it, copy left, you cannot copyright it, right? You must use the same license in your code if you go on to use it. When you use a GNU project, they are telling you, hey, you have to open source the code that this code was used within. Even if it was a small part of the code, a portion of it, etc. That is what controls for these kinds of things. So I'll leave it to you to read it, and I'll put a link to this description later on. But needless to say, sometimes these licenses can be quite long. And so it's something for you to sit down with and really read through. I won't do it here just because this video would be 30 minutes. So you've seen those two examples. Now what happens obviously if you're breaking the license? You know, I'm talking about this in very kind of vague ways, so let's just be super clear. In order for someone to enforce a license against you, they would have to sue you, right? That means that multiple things are true, right? I notice, let's say, that you are using my open source project. Great. So now I want to sue you. I want to come after you in some way. What is actually going to happen, right? That it depends a little bit on what the license says, obviously. But generally speaking, my advice is to be good because people will figure it out depending on how big it is. In order for you to actually get sued, what's happening is something like this. One, like we said earlier, the license outlined the rules. So two, you must be in violation of the license that you, like I said earlier, implicitly agreed to. You didn't sign a contract. You just took the code, you started using it. You have implicitly agreed to that license. So one, you must be actually violating the rules of the license that you already agreed to. In order for you to violate the rules that were laid out, that means that you now are in violation and the other party, in this case, let's say me, is aware. I'm aware you're stealing my code, let's say, for the sake of argument. But the second thing is obviously it must be actually legally feasible and realistic for a court to enforce it. It has to be practical. The letter of the law and the practicality of enforcement are both what matters, obviously. So if you are using my software for in a jurisdiction, maybe you're on the other side of the world or you're very far away, maybe a court's not actually willing to drag us in to make that happen. It kind of depends on a lot of different factors like jurisdiction, foreign entities, etc. You can read a lot more about this. Maybe some of my patent colleagues have more fun stories to share there. But generally speaking, obviously, it has to be, if you're going to sue someone, the court has to actually be able to bring them in. It has to have what's called jurisdiction. The court can bring them in to hear the case. Great. Hey, Your Honor, here's my license. They took my code. Here's the proof. I want to sue. I want an injunction, or maybe I want some damages or whatever. Great. So the third thing that obviously has to be true in order for someone to come after you is not only that the court can actually bring them in, right? That can actually bring them into court and that they're violating the license. One, I have to actually have an attorney who thinks this is worth their time and, more importantly, worth the court's time. And also, obviously, worth my time and money to make it happen, right? Certain cases, for example, if I'm an open source company and I have a $5 a month open source software license, that's not that uncommon, right? Some of these projects are small. Am I going to realistically have an attorney go and drag someone into court? Maybe not, right? Maybe that's not really worth an attorney's time. Maybe a judge would say this was frivolous to be filing an action over $5, for example, and then you can have all kinds of fun with the Seventh Amendment and reading about some of these minimum amount and controversy requirements and whatnot. But more importantly, I just want you to have in your mind that generally speaking, are attorneys going to be filing actions against you if you use a piece of open source code? Probably not. But this is why I say people will figure it out, because if you're worried about this problem, it probably means you should just go and get the license. Sometimes what happens is you'll get a very scary seeming email that says, hey, this is David Awad on behalf of one of my clients, LLC, and we are aware that you are using a license or acting in violation of the license that this software was distributed under. Please do procure a license immediately or we'll be seeking damages, something like that. Now, what that means is basically, hey, you're using our code, you didn't pay for it, pay for it. The vast majority of the time, if you're dealing with this kind of an issue, that's what's going on. So there is a legal and practical reality to this. Not every open source software project with a $5 license is going to be coming after you, but you should get licenses. You should not use software projects without licenses. There are all kinds of horror stories about this. My favorite example being back with Truth Social, when Mastodon sued the Trump organization pretty famously, who had tried to make a copy of Mastodon for Truth Social, and then it became clear to the developers that this was a copy of Mastodon that was not being used with a license because that license was incompatible, causing millions of dollars in PR nightmare and litigation and engineering time that had to be thrown out because they were never going to open source that code base. So that's the kind of thing you want to watch out for, and what we're trying to prevent with education and resources like this one. So here are a couple of common licenses just so you can get a sense of what they are. These are probably the ones you will run against the most that you just want to be aware of. And I listed some examples here. So generally, the licenses you're going to see. MIT license. I've defined it here. I think it's quite accurate. I do not care. I am not responsible. You take this code. You do whatever you want. I don't want to hear about it again. That's basically what this means. So there are a ton of projects that use the MIT license because it's great. It's very flexible. It essentially says to you as the open source developer, nobody's going to be coming after you and saying you're liable for your software not working in their use case, right? It's very common because, of course, I as a developer, I don't know who's going to use the software. I can't be liable for it. So Node, React.js, Next.js, these are examples of projects using this. All kinds of projects under the sun use the MIT and Apache licenses, our second one. Now, the only difference between Apache that you may notice sometimes if you go onto certain web pages is the Apache license says you can use this software however you like. We are not responsible, but if you use our software in your project, you should mention that somewhere prominently within your, what they call the quote, distribution of the software. So maybe you put an addendum on the bottom of your website. Maybe you have a separate page in the terms of service or in the About Us page about the company or about the product, and you say this product was developed using TensorFlow, Kubernetes, Docker, etc. Maybe now you're running into an unusual example. Maybe you're trying to use Mastodon, like we said earlier, or Redis, and you are running into the GNU GPL license, or one of the varieties of it. There's a few versions of it, and I won't get into that here. So maybe you're in a situation where you want to use one of those projects. Now you have to make sure that if you use it, you are aware that you have to open source your entire project. This is fine for certain things, right? Some of the original shell utilities from GNU all used this license, and projects built on top of them also were open source and shared the same license. That's very common. The whole idea is that this is an open source building block, and if you build on top of it, that must also be open source. The theory being it's a propagating license. The last one that I want to tell you about is the SSPL. This is one, it's not that this specific license is so widespread. It's used by MongoDB and Elastic, companies like that. My thing about these kinds of licenses is they emerge from kind of a unique series of problems. So MongoDB, as an example, which you may know if you're not aware, is an open source database, right? It's an open source database technology. So you can store data, you can pull it out, great, very easy to use, and it was great for fast prototyping and popular with developers. So what happened? Eventually, large cloud providers came around and said, hey, it would be cool if we hosted MongoDB and then charged people for our distribution of MongoDB instead of people using and paying MongoDB itself. So that's a huge problem and kind of tricky. So what starts to happen? Eventually, Mongo gets wise to this and they say, hey, we're doing all the work to update and maintain the database. You're just hosting the infrastructure, but you're trying to capture more of the value that we're creating. So they come up with this license that says some combination of the following. We're open source. You can review the code, you can make copies of it, and you can use it in your proprietary applications, but you cannot compete with us directly. Essentially what they're saying is you can't compete with us on our core business. You cannot distribute our software specifically, and you can't compete with us on our core business without getting a license from us. So MongoDB, Elastic, companies like that use licenses like this. There's other similar licenses, but this is where things start to get a little more fragmented and is outside the scope of this video. But just be aware that sometimes different businesses do get these licenses and they matter for some of those companies because, again, it's all about creating value from open source and then capturing it. So that is those licenses. And I think that's basically about it as far as what I wanted to cover. I would remind you again, none of this is legal advice. So please do be aware that if you want help figuring out a license, you're welcome to just tweet, DM, contact me. I will happily help you. I'll have all of those links under the description. You can contact me, ask any questions you like. I'm happy to answer. I don't nickel and dime like that. And if you're having trouble, honestly, there's a lot of really good resources out there. GitHub publishes this very nice choosealicense.com. That'll be in the description as well. It outlines what are the tools. Maybe you can just click through the bubbles, and that's going to be enough for the vast majority of people. You won't even need an attorney. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm wishing you all the best of luck with your startups, companies, open source projects, and infrastructure endeavors. I'm cheering for all of your joy and success. Once again, not legal advice, and I will see you around. Bye.